All right, Alexander, let's do an update on Ukraine. And the big story is the spring offensive, the fighting in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka. But I think the spring offensive is the big story, or at least the talk about a spring offensive. But before you give your take on what's going on the ground, and then your thoughts on the spring offensive. Reznikov, the Ukraine Minister of Defense, he was in Bulgaria. He was in Greece yesterday. He's going to be in Cyprus now, and he's just basically going around looking for ammunition. And he has gotten some ammunition, but he was also looking for some heavier weapons. From Greece, for example, he was looking for the S-300s. And the Greeks said, we can't give you the S-300s because of the situation we have with Turkey. And that was the excuse that they used. But he did get ammunition. He got Stingers and some other stuff. And now in Cyprus, he's going to ask for the same thing. I mean, to open up the discussion, my question to you is this normal? I mean, we're going to get a spring offensive. We're going to get a spring offensive in 2-3 weeks, according to what Blinken said yesterday. Blinken said in 2 weeks, we're going to have a spring offensive. And Reznikov, the Ukraine defense minister, is in Greece, a country of about 10 million in population. A powerful military, but not a huge military, but a powerful military, a good military for a country of its size. And then he comes to Cyprus, a country of 800,000, asking for ammunition and weapons for a spring offensive that's happening in 2 weeks. Does this make any sense to you whatsoever?
It makes absolutely no sense at all. I mean, I think it's nuts. It suggests that Ukraine is far from ready for any kind of spring offensive or any kind of offensive, that they're going around hat in hand, begging everybody now, even the smaller European countries, for ammunition, that they haven't sorted out their supply lines, that they're nowhere near ready to launch any kind of offensive. And of course, the Russians can see that. Everybody can see that. We've been talking many times in many programs. We discussed it with Brian Beletic on the Duran. The fact that the West hasn't supplied Ukraine with the level of ammunition that it would sustainably need to carry out an offensive. It hasn't provided Ukraine with enough tanks, without infantry fighting vehicles and all of those things. And yet Ukraine is still going to go ahead with this offensive, but Reznikov is going around all over Europe. He's going to Bulgaria, another country, was it 8 million, 7.5 million now, trying to get ammunition there. He's going to Greece trying to get ammunition. He's going to Cyprus. The Germans have said, we haven't got any more to give. The French have said, we haven't got any more to give. The mighty United States has come up with a certain amount, but nowhere near enough. There's disagreements amongst the Europeans about how they're going to pay for new ammunition production, but even if and when that gets started, that's not going to be ready for several years. So the whole thing is it has a squalid look about it. I mean, this isn't the kind of behavior you would expect a defense minister to be engaging in on the eve of an offensive, an already announced and declared offensive. If they are reduced to this sort of thing, the right thing to do is to call it off. to call off this whole idea of an offensive, go back to the drawing board, think about what you can do with the forces that you have, whether you can hold out much longer, or whether you need to retreat to some places. You certainly shouldn't be looking at an offensive in this kind of way.
Blinken said 2 weeks we're going to get the offensive, and he seemed very confident that Ukraine is going to take Crimea. That's how he's like, when we take Crimea, we'll leave it up to Zelensky what he wants to do, because Ukraine is a democracy, and so we'll leave it up to him. What is going on here?
Yeah, I mean,
what are the scenarios that could be happening? This could all be a bluff.
Yes.
Okay. This could be a terrible miscalculation, terrible planning, and You know, it's like you said, the spring offensive turns out to be a disaster. Could this also be a distraction so that they could launch some sort of an offensive, which they know is not going to work, so that they can do something else in the West? I mean, we had the meeting between Zelensky and Poland, and I would like your thoughts on that. Are they planning something there? You know, I believe Foreign Policy magazine actually ran an article late in March talking about how the unification of Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine would solve a lot of problems. It would allow Ukraine to enter into NATO. It would create a security buffer. It would counter the Germans and the French. All these things that Foreign Policy magazine wrote about. I mean, is something going on there? Because I can't wrap my head around this spring offensive strategy.
Yes.
Nothing makes sense. The only other thing that could be going on is maybe there's more forces than they're letting on. Maybe this is going to be a bigger campaign than we thought.
Exactly. Well, there are a lot of people.
How do you explain it?
There are a lot of people, especially on the Russian side, who think the last, that this is all a distraction, that it's all a disinformation exercise, that Ukraine is far better equipped and far better armed and has far more men prepared for this offensive than all these reports imply, and that this is all intended to put the Russians into a condition of complacency, and that the Russians are not going to be fooled by it, and all that. I have to say I'm skeptical about that theory. I think that, first of all, I suspect that the Russians have a pretty good idea, actually, of the number of forces that Ukraine actually has at its disposal. So I think a disinformation exercise like this isn't going to work, and I don't think there's any point in it. So I don't think that's what's going on. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is about a disinformation exercise. This is just too elaborate for that. I mean, it's been conducted on too squalid a scale to be just a disinformation exercise. I mean, would you really be going to Cyprus and asking for shells as part of a disinformation exercise? I mean, wouldn't you do it some other way? Wouldn't you have public encounters between the Americans and the Ukrainians and things of that kind? I mean, it just doesn't feel right to me in those terms. My own take on this is actually very simple. I think that you have a group of people in Washington, the neocons, the president, and people like Lloyd Austin, who, as we've discussed, is a very political general. They've been gambling right through this crisis ever since it started. They're still gambling. They've ordered Ukraine to carry out this offensive. And Ukraine, some people in Ukraine perhaps are not very keen on this idea, but they have to do it because he who pays the piper calls the tune. They have to launch this offensive, and of course the hardliners insist on it. So they're going to launch this offensive in 2 or 3 weeks' time. This is now a political imperative. The future of the administration and of its grand strategy and its grand plan depends on it, and they're not going to be talked out of it. I think that there's an accumulation of facts which suggest that this is not a good idea at all, but the people in the White House are simply paying no attention, that they just don't want to hear about any of this. And I don't think there's any grand plans. I don't think there's grand plans to launch offensives in multiple directions, as some people are saying. I don't think Ukraine has the force any longer to launch offensives in multiple directions. So I think that that's really what it's about. It's all about politics in Washington. You launch this offensive. The assumption is it's going to be successful. You've provided Ukraine with infantry fighting vehicles. You've provided Ukraine with a certain amount of training. You have this entrenched contempt for the Russians. You assume this is going to work because, according to your ideological set of beliefs, it must. And I think that's all there is to it myself. I mean, I don't think it's more complicated than that. Now, that's my own guess, but of course, others are entitled to their own view, and we'll see what comes.
Who is they? You
Who's
mentioned
they?
Lloyd Austin.
Austin.
I mean, we could say the usual suspects: Sullivan,
Yeah.
Austin, Newland, Blinken. Is there any more people in the they that you think are pushing for this offensive? And who do you think? What groups do you think are telling them, if any, that this is a bad idea? And also pull in the Europeans as well.
Yes.
Which camp they fall into. I would imagine that the Polish authorities are also part of the Austin Sullivan they. That's the way it looks
Absolutely.
like to me. Since Poland is very keen on this, as are the Baltic states.
As are the Baltic states, as are countries like Denmark, and of course Britain, which has also provided some amount of help there, as are people like Baerbock and Habeck in Germany. Though Habeck has just been to Kiev and has apparently told the Ukrainians, no more weapons, Germany's run out. So there are Ursula and all her lot. No doubt all of those people, Stoltenberg, they all want this offensive to happen because, as I said, ideologically it's essential. And of course, the other thing to bear in mind, and there's been a very interesting cache of NATO documents that's just been published. I haven't had time and opportunity to study them properly, but there's claims that these documents are real and some that they're not and whatever. But I suspect these people are getting an awful lot of false information. They probably think that the situation on the battlefronts is much more favorable to Ukraine than it really is, that the Russians are much weaker than they actually are. And I think that they probably do think, all it needs is one more heave and it will work. Because they can't really see otherwise. As to who is arguing against it, the answer is some people within the uniformed military in the United States. We see people like Milley. Milley is I have to say, in my opinion, a shabby figure. Because on the one hand, he goes along all the time with every demand that the White House and Lloyd Austin are making, and then as soon as he's done that, he goes off and gives an interview in which he says, well, I don't actually think they'll be able to regain all their territory or retake Crimea or do any of these things. So I think the uniformed military, the people who are advising the Joint Chiefs of Staff, are saying this isn't going to work. Milley knows it, but at the same time, he doesn't have the courage, the political courage, to stand up to the president and to the people around him. And I think this is really what's going on.
Yeah, I saw that leak. I read the New York Times article based on that leak. I think you're exactly right, even though you haven't gone into it in detail. To me, it seems like if that leak is to be trusted,
yes,
and maybe it's real, it seems like the U.S. military is getting a much more favorable view of things than what the reality is on the ground. Favorable in terms of for Ukraine. If it's not to be believed, if it's a psyop, well then that also leads me to believe that once again you're looking at some sort of misinformation campaign or distraction to present a picture that is not accurate. But I can't figure out why they would, what's the purpose of putting these documents out there in order to influence who?
Yes.
So I mean, I believe the leak, but I don't. But I think the numbers that the leak has in there seem very. It just doesn't. It doesn't feel right. It seems like there's some sort of misinformation from what the Pentagon is giving Ukraine and what Ukraine is reporting back to the Pentagon.
Well, exactly. Well, this is one of the most interesting facts because, of course, there's also reports in the British media that the same figures that you are saying, don't give accurate information, they also say that the figures don't give an accurate information because they're bad for Ukraine. So the documents have been distorted by the Russians. I mean, all sorts of crazy things are going around this. But I think it's been well established and for a long time that most of the information Washington is getting about the state on the battlefronts comes from the Ukrainian General Staff. And I think that the Ukrainian General Staff is putting an over-optimistic spin, that's putting it mildly, on the overall situation. And I think that's being conveyed to the US, and that's basically what we're seeing. So as I said, they're getting a false picture of the actual situation. I mean, what I believe to be a false picture of the actual situation. And I think this is one of the reasons why there's this false optimism going on.
Why did Zelensky go to Poland?
Yeah.
What do you think the reasoning for that was?
Well, this is actually a good question, because the Poles have taken this extremely aggressive pro-Ukrainian position, the Polish government, I should say, one which is starting to meet increasing amount of opposition within Poland itself. By the way, there have been protests about Zelensky's visit. There have been comments about the luxurious conditions that he's travelled in, his train and all that kind of thing. So there's been some pushback amongst people in Poland. But I do think that there is a view within the Polish government that this is our opportunity to re-establish the Polish Commonwealth as this huge country that used to dominate Eastern Europe back in the 17th century, a long, long time ago. And, you know, this idea of union with Ukraine, a way of getting Ukraine into NATO by the back door. I think this is generally being floated by some people, and I suspect Zelensky was partly in Poland for that reason. I think that it is not a coincidence that that article in Foreign Policy came out exactly timed with this. But, of course, there's going to be enormous opposition. There's going to be opposition within Poland. There's probably going to be quite a lot of opposition within Ukraine. And we've already seen that some NATO countries, including, by some reports, the United States itself, don't want Ukraine in NATO at this time because they don't want to be dragged into a war with Russia. So, again, you get the sense that there's one group of people pushing in one direction and another group of people within the West pushing in a completely different one. That there's no real agreement about how to move forward.
Yeah. Before I ask you to comment on the situation in Bakhmut and Avdiivka, just real quickly, what's going on the ground in Ukraine? What do you make of the White House's explanation for what went wrong in Afghanistan? And does that hint to how the White House may also do the same thing if things go bad in Ukraine? Because the Biden White House pretty much said that what happened in Afghanistan was Trump's fault, and we're all good here.
Yeah,
we did everything right. To me, I look at that and I say, okay, that's probably how the White House will explain Ukraine. I'm not saying they're going to blame it on Trump, but they'll figure out someone or something to blame it on if things go the way of Afghanistan and Ukraine.
That's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to blame someone else. It's always there. So Trump was to blame for Afghanistan. Who knows? You can find all kinds of people who are to blame for what's going to go on in Ukraine. It's either the Chinese or the Germans, or the Germans in particular, I suspect, will be blamed quite a lot. The Germans have got themselves into an absolute right awful mess over this one, in my opinion. But anyway, that's another story. But they will look for someone to blame. They will say that the Europeans didn't give enough support. The previous administration, the Trump administration, didn't give enough support. They might even, who knows, it might be a dangerous thing to do, actually say that Obama also didn't do enough to support Ukraine because he wouldn't let US weapons go to Ukraine. And of course, the prime blame will go onto the Republicans because the Republicans are going to cut off the funding. And it's the fact that the Republicans are not going to allow open-ended support for Ukraine, that there's growing opposition to providing support for Ukraine. This will be the stab in the back that has brought about the failure in Ukraine. If it had all been left to Jake Sullivan and Victoria Newland, Vicky Newland, and Robert Kagan, lurking in the background, giving all the advice that he's giving to his wife and to all the others, well, it would all have turned out right. That's what they said, remember, not just about Afghanistan. They said it about Iraq too. That Iraq, it would have been fine if we'd done more. Always, as far as these people are concerned, it's the failure to do more that is the reason for failure, not the fact that they did too much.
Yeah. Okay. Bakhmut.
Bakhmut, well...
I mean, it's going bad, but
it's going very bad.
What are the details?
It's going very bad. Well, I mean, one can get into the huge numbers of details, but to get a sense of how bad it is, even the British Ministry of Defence today issued a bulletin admitting that it is going very bad in Bakhmut. So the Russians, the Wagner organisation, now has central Bakhmut under their control. They're pushing hard into the west. They're taking places block by block. The British Ministry of Defence has now acknowledged that the roads into Bakhmut are almost unusable by Ukraine, and it really does look as if Ukraine is now hanging on by its fingernails to the small part of Bakhmut that it still controls. I've been told, I read somewhere, that the perimeter of the area in and around Bakhmut, still controlled by Ukraine, has now shrunk to 5 kilometers, the sort of distance of the perimeter itself. And that means that the Russians can shell any part, any point within it. Ukraine is now desperately weak, it seems to me, where it is. And I think, assuming that, we don't have any dramatic changes, it's going to be over very soon. I mean, Blinken is talking about an offensive in 2 weeks' time. I would have thought that by 2 weeks, Bakhmut will be finished, actually.
All right, let's end it there. Real quick, do you believe what Prigozhin said the other day, that the Russian military decided not to close the pincer in Bakhmut, to close the cauldron shut so that they could allow Ukraine military to enter? Do you believe that?
Yes.
That statement from Prigozhin?
Yes, I do, actually. I think he's absolutely right. I think there was a reason for that. I think that the Russians calculated that if they did encircle those Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut, it would have prolonged the battle by weeks, probably, and it would have been very, very costly. Ukraine has suffered huge losses in Bakhmut already. From a Russian point of view, it now makes more sense to just capture the place and end the battle. I think there was a lot of discussion about this. I think Prigozhin himself would clearly have preferred to close the pincers. That's my own sense about this. But I think the decision was made that it made more sense to let the Ukrainians leave. Remember, when they do leave, they'll have to pass the crossfire of the Russian shells. So quite a lot of them will be killed. Most of their heavy equipment will be lost. Tens of thousands have already died. From a Russian point of view, Bakhmut, this battle has served its purpose. They might as well capture it and move on to their next objective, which will be Avdiivka, by the way, where there are reports that they're now in the process of capturing another village called Pervomaiska, which will bring you closer towards encircling Avdiivka. Putin had a meeting with Pushilin, who is the head of the Donetsk regional government. And again, Pushilin is pushing very hard for Avdiivka to be taken so that the shelling of Donetsk ends. And it's important to stress, this is for the Russians at the moment in time, present moment in time. It is their major strategic political priority. They have to end the shelling of Donetsk city. That was what the war was all about. And that's what they have to give the most attention to, even if you could argue that from a strategic, tactical, purely military point of view, it might be wiser to concentrate on other things. I thought that in August when they captured a village called Pesky and decided to focus on Pesky rather than Bakhmut, for example. But politics and war, are always entangled. The reality is the Russians can't just allow Donetsk to be shelled indefinitely. So they're going to sort out Bakhmut, sort out Avdiivka, sort out a place called Seversk to the north of Bakhmut, and they want to take Bakhmut now, so that this whole thing is wrapped up as soon as possible, ideally before the Ukrainian offensive starts.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Then they have to deal with a big Ukrainian spring offensive,
Yes.
which, according to the U.S. State Department, will end up right on the borders of Crimea.
That's right. Yes.
We'll see. The Duran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Rockfin, Odyssey, BitChute, and Telegram. And go to Duran Shop, 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.